So just before we dive into this passage then, you'll remember, so I was speaking on the chapter before this, a couple of weeks back, and I started off by saying these passages, just towards the end of Mark, contain some of Jesus' sterner words, and I mentioned that it's important to read them in the context of something. Does anyone remember what that was? Find out how well I do my job. The earlier part of Mark, absolutely, which says what? Among other things, we see testimony after testimony of, it's good to repeat it, the love of God. Okay, throughout the whole first half of Mark, you see God encountering people and showing incredible, deep love for them. You see Jesus meeting a leper, and the leper says, if you're willing, you can heal me. And he says, I am willing, and he touches him. We see Jesus raising a girl from the dead. We see Jesus meeting a woman with a long-running history of illness and her being healed through him, and then him honouring her as well, rather than just allowing her to slip away unnoticed. We see time and time again Jesus' love in words and in action. So it's important to remember as we look at some of Jesus' sterner words that they are part of God's love. And those of you who are parents will know that those things go hand in hand when you have children, that your love is sometimes shown in sternness as well as often in kindness and kind words. So let's make sure we read it in that context. A lot of these words here are very self-explanatory. You know, when it says that you will be handed over to local councils and flogged in synagogues, we don't need to have that explained to us what that means. So I'm not going to sort of try and explain things that are obvious already. What I'd like to do is give us some context for understanding what this passage is about and where it points us. And so I want to start off with 4 simple points of context. And the first is around what the Jews believed about the Messiah, because Jesus is speaking into this messianic tradition. And actually, a number of the phrases that he uses very, very clearly point to that messianic tradition. Among other things, when he talks about the sun being dark and the moon turned to blood, that's a very obvious one. One that might perhaps be a little less obvious is when he talks about that day. We just think, oh, that's 2 ordinary words, that day. But that day was a very powerful phrase in the Jewish prophetic tradition. And you find it again and again. And the one I think I've got written down is from Amos 8. But you see it in a number of places where God is saying, you're looking forward to that day, but that day is going to be difficult for many people. And there was this phrase. So Jesus is speaking into that messianic picture. And it's important to understand what those Jews were expecting, because that helps us understand what Jesus is speaking into. Now, I went to Sunday school occasionally as a child. I don't come from a church family, but my mum's parents were one of each, still believers. And so occasionally when we were visiting them, I would go to Sunday school, and the version of sort of human existence that I got is we live our lives and then we get judged on whether we did good or bad stuff, and then we go to be in heaven with Jesus if we were good people. And that's genuinely what I was taught in Sunday school. And actually, sometimes if we're giving a shorthand to a child and we're not being particularly careful about it, we might end up saying, perhaps not the if you're good or bad bit, but the, we get to go and be in heaven with Jesus. But actually, that's not what the scriptures tell us. And it's certainly not what the Jews were expecting. When you read kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven in the gospel, they're not talking about the idea that we kind of go on as souls into eternity in heaven. What they're talking about is the idea that God brings the kingdom to earth. It's the idea that, and in particular for the Jews, this was centered around Jerusalem as the center of the world, the temple as the center of Jerusalem, and God was going to come and restore Israel to its right place. He was going to restore the temple to the center of Jewish life. And it was not just going to be for Jews, but Gentiles would be drawn in, and there would be an earthly kingdom in which God was king over a Davidic king who would himself see that worship was done rightly. And so it was very much about a kingdom on earth. So when Jesus is speaking into this, he's not speaking into the context of people thinking, when this day comes, we'll all die and float off to heaven or something else. He's talking into a context in which people are saying, okay, Jesus, you're going to come and if you're the Messiah, you're going to come and restore your earthly kingdom here, which explains perhaps why, as the disciples walking out and seeing these incredible buildings are going, that's going to be the seat of power. Yeah, I like this. You can understand that going on in there because that's what they believed that this messianic kingdom was going to be like. And we know that Even the disciples took until after Jesus' death and resurrection to really understand that his kingdom was not going to look quite like that. It does actually matter, doesn't it, that we understand what it is that God intends for this earth. Somebody said once, if you work in a classic car restorers and somebody brings you in this beaten up classic car and says, I'd love you to make this look like new. You say, yeah, sure, what are you going to use it for? Oh, I'm going to drive it in a destruction derby in a month's time. You're not going to take very much care over that car, are you? Because you know it's just going to be smashed up again in a week or a month. And actually thinking about the climate change topic that this women's breakfast is on, if this earth is just going to be destroyed, as some of the pictures in the scriptures seem to point to, if it's just going to be totally wiped away and God's just going to give us a new one, it probably affects how we look at it. If it's going to be renewed, that's different, isn't it? And this matters. So anyway, I want to say that it really, really matters what we think about the end of the world. I mentioned that as the disciples are leaving, they comment on this impressive temple. You know, maybe this will be the seat of government. Again, just cutting the disciples some slack. You know, these really are impressive buildings and impressive stones by a human standard. So I went and looked it up. Josephus, who's the Jewish historian who writes most about this time, he gives some dimensions for stones in the temple. And some of the stones there are fully 3 times as big as Stonehenge stones in each direction, so it's like 25 times the weight. These are huge, huge lumps of rock. And there's this incredible building that was still actually a little bit under construction. And it had been built over years and years and years, this incredible structure. And so you would imagine they would have been impressed, particularly if they thought that this was going to be part of this future kingdom. But in that process, they miss 2 really important things. And the first one we've already read about. Jesus has seen this temple, and he's not impressed. He's welcomed into Jerusalem as king by these crowds, and he comes to the temple, and the people who should have been there welcoming him see him as either an obstruction, something to be, an awkwardness to be got rid of, or they just don't notice. He comes to his temple and it's not ready. And then he comes back the next day and he has to drive traders out of the courts because they're obstructing the people of God from coming in prayer. Oh, sorry, not the people of God. They're obstructing the Gentiles, rather, from coming to the people of God and praying to the Lord. So he comes to his temple and it's not ready. And in fact, he calls it a den of robbers. And he's passed judgment on it already. But the second thing is, while they're marveling at these amazing buildings around them, and this one I think really sits with us as well, they're walking next to Jesus, who made mountains just by speaking. And all these people have hauled rocks around and they've made something that is a fraction of the size of a mountain. And the Lord spoke and created planets. And they don't see somehow the discrepancy between thinking this temple looks amazing and yet they're with Jesus. And this is something for us, isn't it? We can walk through life and we can appreciate the blessings that God gives us. And I'm, as much as anyone else, I'm up for walking over Shotover and marveling at how God has made all things good and how he's made a good world for us to enjoy. But the real marvel is I get to walk life with Jesus Christ along my side. And you get to walk life with Jesus by your side. We get to speak with him. We get to hear his voice speaking to us. We get to know him now and we will know him more. And that is beyond impressive. That's beyond huge rocks. It's beyond incredible structures. It's beyond the beauty of trees in autumn or whatever it is that does it for you at this time of year. We get to live life with Jesus. Let's not lose the wonder of that. We might need to recapture it because the disciples, we know that they are in awe of Jesus, right? They see him calm the storm and they say, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. And yet maybe over time, the familiarity just dials down that awe and that wonder. And so they're marveling at buildings instead of at Christ. The third point of context is about how Jewish prophecy works. And it's probably not just Jewish prophecy. Maybe it was true of other oracles in other languages that were given, but certainly in Jewish prophecy, there's this constant double horizon. So wave a hand if you do any hill walking or mountaineering at all, a few of you. Okay, so you'll know the context of a forepeak, which is you're walking up. In fact, you can see this on Ladder Hill. If you stand at the bottom of Ladder Hill and you look up, then the top of the hill is up about where the Spares live. Except when you get up there, you sort of go, oh, no, it's not. It still goes on a bit further. And on a bike, you really feel it. It's just not Millview, is it? But it's before you get to Millview. But there's another peak that's hidden. And there comes a tipping point where you see not only what you thought was the peak, but also you start to see the peak that's just beyond it. It's a really big deal in mountaineering because you can actually sometimes get to what you think is the peak, and you've got to go down and then up again. And it can be really, really disheartening. But actually, what we see in Jewish prophecy again and again is these two horizons in view. Isaiah prophesies about Christ. The virgin will be with child. And we think about that, and we just think about Christ. But actually, he's also prophesying about two kings. The whole point of what prompted this prophecy was that the king of Israel was desperately worried about these two invading kings. And Isaiah says, you don't need to worry about them, because their strength is just people. The virgin will be with child, and he prophesies about Christ, and he says, and before all that happens, these two kings will be dealt with. There's always these two horizons in Jewish prophecy, and we see that here as well, as Jesus speaks in this prophetic tradition, is that there's two horizons in view. There's the near, because he's speaking about Jerusalem and what's going to happen there shortly, and there's the far, because he's talking about the age to come. And it's not that Jesus is muddled, and it's not that we can't understand it. I hope I don't have to say that it's not because Jesus is muddled, but it's because this is how it works. He's looking at something that's going to happen and saying this is going to happen, but he's also looking beyond it and saying, and that gives us a picture of what's really to come, the bigger thing. Okay, and the last point of context is this. What is Jesus' purpose in talking about it? Because people have taken this passage and passages in Daniel which talk about sevens and 77s and this kind of thing, and they've calculated dates for the ends of the world, and we all like to have a little bit of a chuckle at them. But actually, we can read this and we can end up thinking, okay, so I wonder if, could this be about this world event, and could this be about this world event, and that means that... And Jesus is really clear. First of all, nobody knows the hour, and he points out his own limitation that he has taken upon himself when, as we read in Philippians, Christ empties himself. He takes on limitations. One of those is that he doesn't even know the hour. He leaves it to the Father to appoint the hour. So how are we going to know? Certainly not because we're good at maths, no offense to you, Ben. And Jesus' purpose comes out really clearly because he finishes off with a parable that makes it obvious. He says, therefore, be watching. Be ready. And we've just seen in the last few chapters a number of people who aren't ready when Jesus comes. The Jewish leaders weren't ready. The temple wasn't ready. The fig tree that Jesus visited was all in leaf as though it was ready, but it wasn't ready. And Jesus uses that as a picture. It would be really interesting, and I want to encourage you to do this week. Read through the chapters that are still to come and see how this theme of readiness comes up. Just as a hint, in Gethsemane, what is it that Jesus says to his disciples? He says, keep watch, be awake. And he comes back and they're asleep. That's just one. If you read through, you'll see again and again these people and Jesus encountering them. And some of them are ready for who he is and what he's doing, and some of them are not. Jesus' purpose in this is to tell us to be ready. And in that context, he gives some warnings and some encouragements. So this is sort of a what to expect, what to avoid. And there's 4 of these that come out in the passage. And the first one is deception. Be aware of and avoid being deceived. Many will come in my name saying, I am he. Now, there are many people who have come and claimed to be Christ. Probably more than that, and very much in keeping with the passage, there are many who've come and said, I come in Jesus' name, and by the way, he's changed some things. Or by the way, you changed some things and we need to work out what it was back then. And we could go into Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. Actually, in some ways, that was part of the message of Muhammad. Hence, keeping some of the Old Testament scriptures and saying, oh yeah, those are real, but the church has changed the truth about Jesus, and he didn't really die on the cross. There are deceptions, people who come saying, let's just twist this message. And Jesus says, don't be deceived. You'll know when I come back. Because it won't be possible to miss it. He talks about how lightning lights up the sky from one side to the other. Perhaps you've had that experience where you've been inside with the lights on, and even though you're inside with the lights on, suddenly there's a flash through the curtains, and you're like, oh, that was lightning, because that's how bright it is. And we won't be able to screen ourselves from an understanding when Christ comes back. That's really clear from the scriptures. So don't be deceived. The second one that perhaps is more of a danger for us is around fear. What does he say here? When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines, but these are the beginning of the birth pains. We can end up in fear, can't we? Do you know the leading cause, not leading, but fastest rising cause, rather, of anxiety in young people is climate anxiety. Because we consume a diet daily of, we're going to totally wreck this planet. We've gone past the point of no return. If we don't get this accord through, then we're absolutely all going to die. And even if we do, to be honest, it's a bit touch and go. And as Christians, we have to think, what do we do with this? Because we get two kind of slight Mickey Mouse caricatures in the media. On the one hand, we get the climate change deniers saying, oh no, there's nothing happening here. This is all natural fluctuations and nothing to worry about. And then we get people saying, we're all going to die. And there's nothing in between that says, this matters. This is justice. There are people who are genuinely suffering already because of rising sea levels, because of climate change. There's a matter of justice here. There's a matter of stewardship of what God's given us. And yet, God is in control. We are not all going to die through climate change, because that would imply that we, through our negligence, could drive God's agenda. We cannot set the timetable for God bringing this world to an end. He has set it, and it is not dependent on whether or not we take care of our planet. That's up to him. However, we need to take care of our planet. So there's this line to walk as believers in this, where we need to deeply care about these things, and yet we also need to deeply trust our loving Father. And it's a difficult line to walk. I don't think I walk it right. I think I can be too laissez-faire about this. Caroline is a good prophetic voice to me, saying, we need to care about this more. My parents, who aren't even believers, in some ways grasp some of these things more than me, and I'm needing to be growing and changing in this regard. On the other hand, I do encounter a number of believers who are so bound up in anxiety and fear, and that is equally not what we're supposed to do. And that's about what you might call man-made disaster. Natural disasters, he says, don't be alarmed by those either. And what about wars? Don't be alarmed. Now, can you imagine, probably most of us haven't lived in a war zone. Maybe some of you would have been in Ireland during the Troubles. I don't know, perhaps. Caroline's dad was. And has some stories about that. Maybe some of you will have travelled in war zones, I don't know. But try saying to somebody living in Syria or Afghanistan, oh, don't be alarmed by the war. It sounds really glib, doesn't it? But that's because Christ is calling us to a deep trust, so deep that says that my future is so firmly anchored that even though everything around me is being torn apart and my life could not survive this day, yet I will not fear. And I think that's difficult for us to grasp, but the more we grasp it, the more it will do us good, because that is the rock-solid foundation on which we stand. Our future and our present are held in the hand of Jesus Christ, and they cannot be torn from it. Jesus also warned us about betrayal. That looks like different things to different people, but I think at the very least, probably most of us will have a family or friend, family member or friend where relationship is difficult because of faith. Certainly that's my experience. I expect it will be for many of you. But for others, it goes well beyond that into people who've disowned them. And then you just have to look into the world to find nations where it's common for family members to denounce other family members for belief in Christ. Jesus says, not don't care. He doesn't say it doesn't matter. He just says don't be alarmed. And what he pulls all of this back to is these are the beginning of birth pains. Now, I have to be careful speaking on birth pains. I realise that because I understand that it's several orders of magnitude worse than anything I can ever expect to experience. But there is something about birth pains that they have a purpose. And even from the start of labour being established, even though there's discomfort and then pain and then severe pain. There's a sense of purpose and direction, and you know that at the end of it, something beautiful is coming. And this is what Jesus says about all these things. He says, this is hard. Don't pretend it's not hard. Don't try to push it down and pretend it's not difficult. But he says there is a purpose, and what is coming is good and beautiful, and don't lose sight of that. These are the beginnings of the birth pains. And along with that, therefore, comes a call not to despair. Because we can look around at so many of these things and we could be tempted to despair. Despair isn't just feeling rubbish. Despair is saying there's no hope. Despair is losing sight of where it is that God is taking our world. We mustn't lose sight of that or we will despair. Actually, the opposite of that is that we hope. Our hope is in Jesus Christ, in his action now in this world, and in his salvation, his ability to bring things right, his ability to bring justice and truth. So I've been talking about that as applying to us, which is great, except that he's also talking about destroying the temple. And I've fallen straight into this trap of what is it he's talking about. So who are we talking about? There are these two horizons in view, and one of them is in 70 AD. So 70 AD, the Roman authorities tire of the Jewish nation rebelling again and again, and they decide this time we're going to make an example of them, and they besiege Jerusalem. It's a horrific time. If you've read historic accounts of the time, really, I don't think any siege can be pleasant, but this one is brutal, and it's drawn out, and there's famine, and there's all kinds of things happening inside the city, as do when there's famine. And then the Romans breach the walls, and they massacre the Jewish people. All that Jesus says, about when you see the abomination that causes desolation in the place it shouldn't be. Abomination in the law is anything that was against the very nature of God. It often had to do with idolatry, but not always directly, at least. And this is an abomination that causes destruction. Desolation is the word that gets used when, for instance, Israel's exiled from the land and the land's desolate. And in 70 AD, one of the things that had caused the Jews to rise up was increasing idolatry. You may have read before Jesus came, in fact, there was a ruler who put an idol in the temple. It's thought that possibly something like that may have happened again to prompt the 70 AD riots. We're not entirely sure, but there's this sense of like Jesus saying, when that happens, get what's happening and run for the hills. And we read that actually Jews, many did run for the hills. They stayed in hills around Jerusalem and got out of the city. But those who were stuck inside were massacred without mercy. So that is inside. But there are other things that cannot be pointing to 70 AD. So for instance, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, well, it's only about 30 years from Jesus saying this until 70 AD. I think it's probably fairly unreasonable to talk about wars, plural, and rumors of wars, and also earthquakes. There was one earthquake between 35 and 70 AD. It was near Pompeii, actually. So clearly he's talking not just about the short period before the destruction of the temple, but he's also looking to the future and saying, this is the age to come. So he's talking about 70 AD. He's also talking about the present era and the judgment to come. And there's a little tricky bit here, which some of you may have read and stumbled on, and I know I've struggled with this before. He says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And we read that and we think, okay, well, he's there with his disciples. So that generation, even if they had really young people with them, 8, 9-year-olds, even then, how could it still be talking about today? And for that, we need to understand this word generation. So in the Old Testament, when you read, this is the account of, in Genesis, this is the account of Isaac, this is the account of Abraham. The word there is generation. It literally means these are the generations of, and it talks about, this family line and how it continues down. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Abraham. And that same context comes out even though this is now in Greek. In fact, this word generation can also mean race. So he may well have been saying, this generation won't pass away until the destruction of the temple. But he's also saying, look, this sort of race, this family, the Jewish nation, perhaps the Jewish nation as enriched by the Gentiles being brought into it. We don't fully know what it is Christ was saying there, but this nation will not pass away until all these things have happened. There's a great testimony to the power of God, isn't there, that the Jewish nation has survived to this day. because of God's faithfulness. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. His covenant of faithfulness doesn't pass away. So in closing, Jesus says, keep watch. Now, I often think of keep watch as, soldiers on the walls watching for an enemy, but actually that's not the picture that Jesus gives here. He talks about the servant waiting at the door to open the door to their master. And the question for us is, are we ready like that? Again, we've seen the fig tree. Jesus went to it for fruit, but there wasn't any fruit. We see his parable of the tenants. The tenants had this vineyard, and the master sent to them for his share of the fruit, and they weren't ready to give it to him. And Jesus says, be ready. Be ready for me when I come. And it's with that in mind that I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, does my life testify along with my words that I believe that Jesus is coming back and that he could come back anytime? Does my life really back that up? You have all these illustrations, don't you, of whether people's words tie up with their actions. The one I really like is that I think it's the State University of Ohio, off the top of my head, in the States. It's built as a postmodern bit of architecture. So you have arches that don't go all the way over, and buildings where the bottom seems not to really touch the floor, and rooms that kind of fade out into nothingness. And Rabbi Zacharias, who I realise a complicated name to talk about now, but it was his story, talked about discussing with his driver as he arrived at the university, and the driver was telling him excitedly about this postmodern building, and he said, I wonder if they applied the same thoughts to the foundations. And of course they don't, because everyone knows that for foundations you've got to have stuff that actually connects. You've got to have foundations that go down deep and connect together and lock together. And there's often this difference between what we talk about and what we actually think needs to be lived out. And the same is true with our lives. We say Jesus is coming back. We say, come Lord Jesus. We've sung, about how Jesus has died for us and he's coming back and our hope is in him. And the question is, if somebody came and audited our lives, would our lives really testify to that? It's a difficult question. As I said, I've had a chat with Caroline. We know we need to think about this with relation to our finance. But actually, it's a case of how we use our time. It's a case of how we think about what we invest ourselves in. It's how we do our relationships. Do our lives proclaim he's coming back? So I'm just going to pray, and then I'm going to hand back to Gordon. Jesus, we've been singing this morning that your words are our daily bread. And when we eat, it does us good and it builds our bodies. And God, I pray that this morning your word would do us good and would build us. I pray that it would become the fabric of us, just as what we physically eat becomes the fabric of our bodies. God, I pray that you would shape our lives. Keep us from being hard-hearted. Keep us from being fixed in our ways. And I pray, God, that there would be a radical obedience to you firmly planted in us. That people would look at our lives and say, Jesus must be coming back, because that person's not mad and this is how they're living. We invite you to challenge us, shake us up if you need to, Lord. But please don't leave us unchanged. Change us to be conformed to your likeness. Amen.